Before we begin, ask yourself this. What would you sacrifice to save your family? And what if, in the end, you discovered you were never the one who needed saving? If you're ready for a story that just might stay with you long after it ends, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you won't miss what's coming next. I used to think weddings were supposed to feel warm. I used to imagine laughter, the scent of fresh flowers, soft music curling through the air like a lullaby. My mother had painted that picture for me when I was a little girl, humming over a pot of chamomile tea in our tiny kitchen in Brooklyn. But standing there, in a gown I hadn't chosen, beneath the brutal shimmer of crystal chandeliers on the top floor of Leclerc Tower, I realized something far colder. Not all weddings were about love. Some were just about survival. The room smelled of polished wood and power, like the leather-bound offices I used to pass by on my way to work, places where men made decisions that shattered other men's lives. The guests, faceless figures in black and silver, watched without emotion as Adrien Leclerc stood beside me, his face carved in ice. He didn't look at me. He didn't speak to me. Not once. And why would he? I was nothing to him but a contract, payment, in flesh for my father's debts. A transaction sealed not with love, but with signatures on cold paper 2 nights ago, when my father had knelt at my feet, begging me to do this for him. My life, my name, our family. It's all I have left, Izzy, he had whispered, clutching my hands in his shaking ones. I had nodded, because what else could I do? What else had I ever known, except sacrifice? The officiant's voice echoed like a whisper bouncing off marble walls, reciting vows that neither of us meant. My throat tightened when Adrien slipped the ring onto my finger without glancing at me. A thin gold band, no diamond, no promise. The papers had been signed. The ceremony was just a formality. When it was over, guests drifted toward the champagne, murmuring in low, disinterested tones. No one clapped. No one celebrated. They had come to witness the closing of a business deal, not the beginning of a marriage. I stood there, frozen in place, until a woman I didn't recognize leaned toward me with a polite smile. "Congratulations, Mrs. Leclerc," she whispered, her voice like silk stretched over steel. "You wear the cage beautifully." My breath caught, and just like that, they were gone. Adrift into the city's night like smoke from a candle snuffed too soon. I don't remember how I made it back to the bridal suite. The hallways blurred, the click of my heels swallowed by silence so thick I thought I might suffocate. It was there, in that vast, dimly lit room scented with sandalwood and something darker I couldn't name, that I finally let the tears fall. I stood by the window, looking out over New York's endless lights, the city humming far below as if I didn't exist. I pressed my palm against the glass. "Mom," I whispered, "tell me I did the right thing." I sank onto the velvet chair, beside the dresser. My gown rustled softly as I moved, like dry leaves in the wind. That's when I noticed it, something peeking out from beneath the drawer. A yellowed envelope worn at the edges. My heart stuttered. I reached for it with trembling fingers. I recognized the handwriting immediately. My mother's. Careful, curved letters I hadn't seen in years. She had passed when I was 19, long before my father's world began to collapse. I unfolded the letter, my breath catching in my throat. "If you're reading this, my darling girl, you've chosen a life that might not feel like yours. I only pray you remember who you are when the world tries to make you forget." I clutched the paper to my chest, the words searing deeper than I wanted to admit. Had she known? Had she somehow seen this coming? The cold marriage, the heavy silence, the way I'd become a pawn in someone else's game. Tears blurred the city, lights until they looked like distant stars. I wondered, sitting there in a gown that didn't belong to me, wearing a ring that meant nothing, if somewhere deep inside Adrien Leclerc felt just as trapped as I did. But that was foolish, wasn't it? Men like him didn't feel cages. They built them, and I had just stepped inside one with my eyes wide open. Morning came slowly in the Leclerc penthouse. It didn't arrive with birdsong or sunlight sneaking through lace curtains like it did in Brooklyn. It came through soundless floor-to-ceiling, glass, painting the city in gray and gold. It felt less like morning and more like surrender. I sat alone in the dining room that could have fed 30 people. One plate, one cup of untouched coffee. One woman pretending she wasn't already fading into the wallpaper. Adrian wasn't there. Not that I expected him to be. After the wedding, I hadn't seen him again. Not even a glimpse. We hadn't spoken. We hadn't touched. We hadn't even shared the same air. I told myself it didn't matter. Ours wasn't that kind of marriage. It wasn't even a marriage at all, really. It was an arrangement, nothing more. But as I sat there, in a silk robe someone else had chosen for me, surrounded by polished silver and untouched crystal, I felt something I hadn't expected. Lonely. So I stood. I walked. I searched for something. Anything that felt like mine. I found it in the smallest kitchen at the back of the penthouse, tucked away like a forgotten corner of a castle built for someone else. It smelled faintly of chamomile and lemon, as if someone had once cared enough to boil water. In here. My hands shook as I reached for the tea leaves, the old kettle. I hadn't made tea since the night before my mother passed. She'd always said there was power in small rituals, quiet strength in ordinary things. I closed my eyes, remembering her voice. A good cup of tea won't fix the world, Izzy. She used to whisper with a smile. But it'll give you enough courage to face it again in the morning. So I made it. Slowly, carefully, measuring just the right amount, waiting for the water to hum. I cupped the mug between my palms, breathing in the warmth like it was the only real thing left in the world. I carried it back to my room and sat by the window overlooking Manhattan. I didn't cry this time. I just sipped the tea, letting the quiet fill the cracks inside me. That's when I heard them. 2 voices, low and cautious, drifting down the hallway outside my door. I froze, holding my breath. He hasn't told her. It was a woman's voice, soft but sharp. No, came the reply. James, Adrian's personal assistant. I recognized the clipped British edge to his words. He cleared the hospital debts, she whispered. Paid for her father's treatment too, quietly. But if she ever finds out, you know what she'll think. Let her, James replied softly. Some debts are better paid in silence. I pressed my hand over my heart, feeling it stutter in my chest. Adrian had paid? Not just the business debt, but the hospital bills? My father's treatments? He had done all of it. Quietly. Why? I stared down at the wedding band on my finger, the same band I had wanted to rip off since the moment he'd placed it there without looking at me. I thought of the letter from my mother, still hidden in my drawer like a secret I wasn't ready to face. You've chosen a life that might not feel like yours, she had written. But what if it wasn't just my life that didn't feel like mine? What if Adrian had built his entire life on choices that had never really belonged to him either? I set the tea down carefully, my fingers trembling. For the first time since I had agreed to this arrangement, I realized something that frightened me far more than being unwanted. I might have been wrong about Adrian Leclerc. I didn't go looking for him after that. I wanted to. God, I wanted to. I wanted to march down those endless glass corridors, stand in front of him, and demand to know why. Why he'd paid. Why he'd stayed silent. Why he'd married me like a stranger, but held my family's future in his hands. Like it mattered. But I didn't. Because I wasn't ready to hear whatever lie he'd offer to push me further away. Because part of me needed it to mean something more. So I let the days pass in quiet routine. I made tea each morning in the hidden kitchen. I sat by the window each evening, watching the lights flicker on across the city like tiny, stubborn stars refusing to die. And every night, I thought about the letter, about the words my mother had left behind. You've chosen a life that might not feel like yours. I wondered if she had ever felt the same. Trapped, small, afraid. Week after the wedding, I left the tower for the first time. I didn't tell Adrian. I wasn't sure he would have noticed if I had. The driver waited at the curb, eyes downcast, as I climbed into the black car that smelled faintly of leather and rain. We drove in silence all the way to Brooklyn. The house looked smaller than I remembered. The paint had chipped along the windowsills, and the garden my mother once loved had turned wild and unruly. But the door was still red, the same stubborn shade my mother had chosen 30 years ago when she'd promised herself she'd make this house a home. I stood there for a long moment before knocking. The woman who opened the door looked older than the mother I had kissed goodbye 5 years ago. Her skin was pale, her cheeks hollow, but her eyes still held that same steady light that had carried me through every dark season of my life. Isabel, she breathed, her voice cracking on my name. I stepped inside before the tears could fall. She was lying on the old sofa, a worn blanket draped over her knees. The air smelled of mint tea and lavender oil, her favorite comfort, scents. I knelt beside her, taking her frail hands in mine. You shouldn't have come, she whispered. I had to, I said softly. I needed to see you. Her eyes drifted to the gold band on my finger. You did it, didn't you? I nodded. It's done. She let out a breath I hadn't realized she'd been holding. You saved your father. I swallowed, the lump rising in my throat. He doesn't deserve it. She didn't argue. She never did when it came to him. But then she said something I wasn't expecting, something that cracked open the careful shell I'd built around my heart. Adrian isn't your enemy, is he? I pulled back slightly, frowning. You don't know him, Mom. I know more than you think. She reached for my hand, her grip surprisingly firm. There's something I should have told you a long time ago. She closed her eyes for a moment, gathering whatever strength she had left. Years ago, she whispered, before you were born, your father and I were friends with Adrian's parents. Best friends. We built everything together. Dreams, businesses, families. But your father, he ruined it all. I felt the breath leave my lungs. What are you talking about? She opened her eyes again, tears shimmering like fragile glass. He betrayed Adrian's father, stole from him, lied, left their family drowning in lawsuits while ours survived. I shook my head. No, that's not possible. Adrian. He's the one who could have destroyed us, she said quietly. But he didn't. He never did. Not even when he had every right. I sank back on my heels, the room spinning around me. Why didn't you tell me? Because I was ashamed, she whispered. Because I didn't want you to grow up hating your father, hating the man I once loved. And because part of me hoped you'd never have to pay for his mistakes. My hands trembled in my lap. All this time, all this hate I'd carried, it had been built on lies I'd never seen. That night, I couldn't bring myself to leave her. I stayed until she fell asleep, her breathing soft and steady beneath the thin blanket. I pressed a kiss to her forehead before slipping out into the cool night air. The car was waiting at the curb. I climbed in without a word, my heart pounding louder than the engine. I didn't tell the driver to take me back to the suite. I didn't tell him to take me anywhere. I just sat there, staring out the window as the city passed by in blurred streaks of light and shadow. wondering how long Adrian had carried the weight of a debt that wasn't his to repay. I thought of the tea, the letter, his silence. And when the car finally turned the corner onto Leclerc Tower's private drive, I did something I hadn't planned. I asked the driver to stop. I stepped out into the night alone and walked, not toward the elevators, but toward the east side of the building, toward the glass-walled library I'd passed by a dozen times before without daring to enter. The lights were dim, but I could see him. Adrian, sitting alone in a leather armchair, a glass of something, dark in his hand, staring at a framed photograph resting on the table beside him. I moved closer, my breath catching when I saw it. It was a picture of my mother and his mother, both young, both laughing. Both standing in front of the red door of my childhood home. I pressed my palm to the glass wall, something breaking open inside me. Adrian Leclerc was not the man I thought he was, and maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the woman I had been pretending to be either. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the edge of the guest bed in the far corner of the penthouse, staring at the small silver frame I'd placed on my nightstand. The picture of my mother I'd brought back from Brooklyn. She'd been so full of light in that photograph, smiling as if the world had never once asked her to break for it. How strange it felt now to know she had once laughed beside Adrian's mother. How strange to think the man I had vowed to hate had carried that memory with him all this time. I could have ignored it. Could have let pride keep the distance between us like it always had. But there was something about the way he'd sat there alone. Something about the way his shoulders had slumped when no one was watching. Maybe I should have felt smug. Maybe I should have held on to my anger a little longer. But all I could feel was the ache of something unfinished. Morning came again, soft and gray, pressing its quiet breath against the glass windows. I rose before the house stirred, padded barefoot to that little kitchen in the back. The kettle hissed softly as I set the mug on a tray, placing it next to a small plate of the buttered toast I knew he never ate, but always left untouched in the dining room. It wasn't much, but it was something. I carried the tray to his office door, pausing to gather the courage that felt more fragile than I wanted to admit. My knuckles hovered over the wood for a full minute before I finally knocked. Just once, softly. Silence. I almost turned away, almost convinced myself this was foolish. But then I heard his voice. Low, tired. Come in. He was standing by the window, his back to me, one hand pressed to the glass as if he could push through it to reach something just beyond his grasp. I cleared my throat quietly. I brought you something. He didn't turn right away. Didn't speak. I set the tray down on the small table by the window and waited. The air felt thick between us, heavy with things unsaid. Finally he spoke, his voice rougher than I'd ever heard it. You shouldn't have to do that. I wrapped my arms around myself, suddenly aware of how small I felt in his world. Neither should you, I whispered. His head bowed slightly, as if the weight of those words pressed harder than anything he'd carried before. He turned then, slowly, his face shadowed by something I couldn't name. I don't know how to fix this, he said quietly. I looked down at my hands. Maybe you don't have to. His brow furrowed. What do you mean? I lifted my gaze to meet his, forcing myself to hold it this time. Maybe we just start small, one thing at a time. He didn't move for a long moment. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. He reached for the tea, wrapping his hand around the mug I had brought for him. His fingers brushed mine. It was the first time we had touched since our wedding day, and God help me. I didn't pull away. We stood there in the quiet hum of the city waking below. Two people with nothing to say and everything to learn. After a while, I spoke again, softer this time. Why did you do it? He didn't ask what I meant. He knew. He exhaled slowly, setting the mug down before leaning his palms on the windowsill, his reflection folding into the skyline. I thought, if I paid the debt, maybe it would be enough to keep you away from all this, he murmured. From me. I swallowed hard. Why? Because I didn't want you to hate me more than you already did. My breath caught in my throat. I stepped closer, my fingers trembling as I reached out to touch the back of his hand. I never hated you, Adrian. I whispered. I just didn't understand you. His jaw tensed, like he was fighting the urge to believe me. I bit my lip, feeling the edges of something fragile begin to shift inside me. I saw the picture, I added quietly, of our mothers, together. His posture stiffened, but he didn't pull away. He just stood there, letting the truth hang between us like a fragile thread waiting to snap. I used to think it was all your fault, I continued, my voice shaking. But it wasn't. I know that now. And I'm sorry I never asked for the whole story sooner. He turned toward me then, slowly, as if he were afraid any sudden movement might break the moment. You don't have to be sorry, he said softly. I deserved your anger. I shook my head, fighting the sting of tears. No, you didn't. You deserved better. His expression cracked, just a little, and before I could lose my nerve, I took one more step forward and did the only thing I could think to do. I wrapped my arms around him. Not like a prisoner reaching for freedom, but like someone finally letting go of the weight they'd carried too long. He stood frozen for a heartbeat, and then slowly, carefully, he pulled me closer. His arms circled my back, holding me as if he'd been waiting for this, for me, far longer than either of us had dared to admit. We didn't speak after that. We just stood there, wrapped in the kind of silence that didn't feel empty anymore, the kind of silence that felt full, and for the first time since I'd walked into that cold, glittering tower, I didn't feel quite so alone. It's strange, the things you miss when life feels too heavy to carry. The sound of wind brushing through leaves, the smell of earth after rain, the warmth of sunlight on your face when you're not thinking about how to survive the next moment. I hadn't realized how much I missed those small, ordinary things until I found him in the garden. It was a Wednesday. Cloudy, but not cold. A kind of morning that begged you to step outside just long enough to remember you had a heart still beating in your chest. I had spent the past few days avoiding the question that circled my mind like a restless bird. What happens next? After that morning in his office, after the tea, the apology, the quiet way he held me like I was the first real thing he'd touched in years, I'd found myself standing in the hallway outside his door more than once, wanting to knock, not daring to. We'd shared something. I knew that, but the space between us still felt fragile, as if one wrong word might send us spiraling back into silence. So I waited, and watched, and wondered if maybe, just maybe, he was waiting for me too. It was James who mentioned it, in passing, as he checked on me in the library that morning. He's in the conservatory, he said quietly, as if it wasn't strange at all. The conservatory? I hadn't even known there was one. When James left, I wandered down the hallway I'd never dared to explore. It felt warmer here, less polished. The marble floors gave way to smooth wood. The air smelled faintly of cedar, and something sweeter I couldn't quite place. I paused outside a set of glass doors, and there he was. Adrien Leclerc, the man I had married without knowing the shape of his heart, was kneeling in the dirt, sleeves rolled to his elbows, planting something small and delicate in a pot of dark soil. Lavender. The sunlight filtered through the glass ceiling, wrapping him in a soft glow that made him look different. Not cold, not distant. Just a man tending to something fragile. Stood there, afraid to break whatever quiet spell hung in the air. But then he spoke, without turning around. "I never thought you'd come down here." His voice wasn't sharp. It wasn't guarded. It was almost warm. I stepped closer, brushing my fingers along the leaves of a nearby fern. "I didn't know this place existed." He glanced over his shoulder, one corner of his mouth curving ever so slightly. "Most people don't." I watched him press the soil gently, as if the plant might shatter beneath his touch. "My mother used to spend hours here," he said quietly. She said lavender reminded her that fragile things are still worth keeping. I swallowed the lump rising in my throat. She was right. He looked up at me then, really looked. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I had to brace myself for what I might find in his eyes. "You remind me of her," he murmured. My breath caught. "Because I'm fragile?" "No," he said softly, "because you're still standing." I knelt beside him without thinking, brushing dirt from my hands onto the thighs of my dress, like I used to when I worked in my mother's garden back home. "I used to help my mom plant herbs in our little backyard," I whispered. She said the same thing, that small things could survive if you cared enough to tend them. His fingers stilled in the soil. "She was friends with your mother, wasn't she?" I asked, needing to hear him say it. He nodded. "They were more than friends. They were family in all the ways that mattered." I bit my lip, feeling the ache build in my chest. I didn't know. She never told me. He leaned back on his heels, wiping his hands on a cloth. "I think she wanted to protect you from the weight of what happened between our families." I pressed, my palms into the floor, grounding myself in the quiet truth of it all. "And you?" I whispered. "Why did you never tell me?" His jaw tensed, his gaze dropping to the lavender between us. "Because I didn't want you to feel like you owed me anything. Not love, not forgiveness, not even understanding." I reached for the small plant, letting my fingers trail softly over the petals. "Maybe I don't, but maybe I want to give them anyway." He stilled, and in that fragile, open moment, I dared to ask the question that had been haunting me since the night I first stood in this tower. "Adrien, did you ever want this marriage? Or was it always just payment?" He didn't answer right away. He stood, brushing the dirt from his knees, his back to me once again. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he curled his fists like he was holding something back. And then softly, so softly I almost missed it, he whispered, "I wanted you, Isabel." He turned, meeting my gaze with an honesty that shook me to my core. "I just didn't know how to deserve you." I rose to my feet, my breath catching in my throat. He took a step closer, then stopped, as if waiting for me to close the space between us. So I did. I reached for his hand, dirty and rough, not the polished mask he wore for the world. I laced my fingers with his, grounding both of us in something real, something tender, something quietly brave. "You don't have to deserve me," I whispered. "You just have to let me in." His eyes shimmered with something that looked a lot like hope. And for the first time since we'd said our vows, I believed there might be something worth saving here after all. I used to believe that truth arrived like thunder, loud, jarring, impossible to ignore. But standing in Adrien's private study that evening, I learned the truth sometimes arrives quietly, like the turning of a page. The sun had set early, casting long shadows across the glass walls of LeClaire Tower. We hadn't spoken much since that morning in the conservatory, but the air between us had shifted. It felt less like a battlefield and more like a bridge waiting to be crossed. I found him there after dinner, alone again. He didn't hear me at first. He was seated on the floor, his back resting against the base of a bookshelf, an old leather-bound album open across his lap. The overhead lights were off, leaving only the dim glow of a single desk lamp to illuminate the space around him. I hovered, in the doorway, torn between leaving him to his quiet and stepping into the fragile peace we'd only just begun to build. I chose the second. He didn't look up as I approached, but I could see the way his fingers trembled slightly as he turned. The next page. The air smelled faintly of leather and dust, like the attic I used to hide in as a child when the world felt too loud. "What are you looking at?" I asked softly. He flinched, just barely, but didn't close the album. "Memories," he replied, his voice raw. "Ones I used to think I wanted to forget." I lowered myself to the floor beside him, leaving just enough space that he wouldn't feel cornered. "May I see?" He hesitated, then slowly turned the album so I could look. The first picture was one I'd never seen before. Two women standing arm in arm in front of the red door of my childhood home, my mother and his, both laughing like the world hadn't broken them yet. Tears pricked my eyes before I could stop them. "They look happy," I whispered. "They were," he said quietly, "until your father ruined everything." I flinched, the familiar sting of shame tightening in my chest. "I know," I whispered. "My mother told me the truth about what he did." He nodded, his jaw tight. "He cost my family everything. I watched my father fall apart, piece by piece. I watched my mother lose every friend she had left, except yours." I glanced at him, the weight of his words sinking deep. "I didn't know," I whispered. "I never wanted you to," he replied, turning another page. "I thought, if I kept you at arm's length, maybe you'd never have to carry that guilt. Maybe you could walk away clean." I swallowed hard, staring at the images of two families I never knew had once been so closely bound. "We were never clean, Adrian. None of us." His hands stilled on the page. "I didn't want you to hate me for what your father did, and I didn't want you to hate me for who I was forced to become," I whispered. We sat there, the silence wrapping around us like a fragile cocoon. After a long pause, he spoke again, softer this time. "I didn't marry you for revenge, Isabel. I married you because, for a long time, I've carried something I didn't know how to name." I turned to face him fully, my breath catching in my throat. "And what's that?" He closed the album gently, his eyes lifting to meet mine. "Hope," he whispered. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to hold the weight of that single word without breaking under it. So I reached for his hand again. Not because I had the right words, but because sometimes touch spoke louder than anything else. He let out a slow breath, like he'd been holding it for years. "I was wrong to keep you in the dark," he whispered. "I thought I was protecting you. But maybe I was only protecting myself." I leaned my head against his shoulder, feeling him tense, and then relax. "I think we've both been hiding behind walls that aren't helping anyone," I whispered. He nodded, his voice barely audible. "I don't know how to tear them down." "Maybe we don't have to," I replied softly. "Maybe we just open a door instead." He pulled me closer then, so carefully I could barely feel the movement. And there, on the floor of his study, surrounded by the remnants of a past neither of us had chosen, Adrian Leclerc whispered the first real confession I'd ever heard from him. I want to build something new with you, Isabel. Something that isn't born out of debt, or duty, or guilt. I swallowed the lump rising in my throat. Something real? I whispered. Something real, he promised. And for the first time since, the day I'd slipped that meaningless gold band onto my finger, I believed him. Some moments you carry with you for the rest of your life. Not because they were loud or grand or picture perfect, but because they shifted something so deeply inside you that you knew, somehow, nothing would ever be the same. Finding that letter was one of those moments. I spent the next few days wrapped in something fragile but steady. Almost like peace, Adrian and I still moved carefully around each other, but the silence between us no longer felt cold. It felt patient. Like two people learning to speak a language they had forgotten but once knew by heart. Sometimes we crossed paths in the hallways, and our eyes would linger a little longer than before. Sometimes I'd find him watching me from the doorway as I read by the window, a soft warmth flickering in his expression like candlelight. We didn't rush it, and for the first time I didn't want to. It was a Sunday morning when I returned to Brooklyn alone. Adrian had offered to come with me, but I needed this visit to be mine. My mother had grown weaker. The doctors had done what they could, but her body was slowly letting go. I sat with her for hours in that tiny living room that smelled of lavender oil and old books. I held her hand, listened to her breath as it rattled softly in her chest. She didn't have many words left, but she smiled when she saw me, and that was enough. I spent that afternoon sorting through the drawers in her bedroom, looking for something to bring back to the tower, a small piece of her to hold on to. That's when I found it, tucked between the pages of an old recipe book, sealed in an envelope with my name written in her delicate, familiar handwriting. My heart skipped. I sat on the edge of her bed and slowly opened the envelope, unfolding the letter with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. My dearest Izzy. If you are reading this, then I have already said all the words my lips could carry. But there is one more truth I must place in your heart before I go. I made many mistakes, but none greater than letting you believe you were alone in this world. You are not. You never have been. Adrian. He is not the man I once feared he might become. He is more. He has carried burdens that were never his to bear, all because he loved you long before either of you knew how to name it, if you can let him in, not because you owe him, but because I believe he is the only man who will ever love you the way you deserve to be loved. And if you cannot, if your heart is too bruised to try, know that I understand, and I am proud of you still. You have always been my greatest joy. With all my love, Mom. Tears blurred the page, slipping onto my trembling hands. I clutched the letter to my chest, rocking slightly, as a sob broke free from the place I had locked it away for too long. She knew. She had known all along. And somehow, even at the end, she still believed in us, me and Adrian, when I wasn't sure I could. I stayed with her until sunset, whispering stories of my childhood, of her garden, of the lavender that still bloomed in Adrian's conservatory. She drifted in and out of sleep, her breaths growing softer, slower, and then, sometime just after dusk, she let go. Quietly, gently, the way she had lived her life. I pressed my lips to her forehead, thanking her for every sacrifice she had ever made, for every truth she had carried in silence to protect me. And when I finally stood, I knew there was only one place I needed to be. Adrian was waiting by the window when I returned to the tower. He didn't say anything as I entered the room. He didn't ask. He just opened his arms. I went to him without hesitation. He held me the way no one else ever had. Not as a promise, not as a duty, but as something real, something true. I buried my face in his chest, letting the weight of the day fall into the quiet space between us. "She's gone," I whispered, my voice breaking. He rested his chin on top of my head, his breath trembling against my hair. "I'm so sorry, Izzy." I clutched the letter tighter in my fist, pulling back, just enough to look up at him. "She left me something," I whispered. "A letter. For you." His brow furrowed, but he didn't move as I placed the fragile page in his hands. He read it slowly, his throat working as he swallowed the weight of every word. When he finished, he pressed the letter to his chest, his eyes closing as if he were holding something sacred. And then, without warning, he sank to his knees in front of me. Not because he was broken, not because he was weak, but because he was finally letting himself be seen. He reached for my hands, holding them like they were the only steady thing in his world. "I have spent my whole life trying to repay debts that can never be paid," he whispered, his voice cracking. "But you are the only thing I've ever truly wanted." Tears slipped down my cheeks, my heart pounding so loud I could barely breathe. "I don't care about the past anymore, Adrian," I whispered. "I don't care about debt or duty or anything. Else, I just want you." He let out a shaky breath, pressing my hands to his lips. "Then let me be yours," he whispered. "Not as a bargain, not as a cage, but as the man who will choose you, every day, for the rest of his life." I dropped to my knees with him, cupping his face in my trembling hands. "I'm already yours," I whispered back. "I think I always have been." And in that moment, I knew. We had already begun something new. Spring came early that year, or maybe it only felt that way because for the first time in a long while, I was finally able to feel it. The days after my mother's passing unfolded like a quiet, steady breath. Adrian didn't leave my side. He didn't try to fix what couldn't be fixed, and he didn't fill the silence with empty words. He simply stayed, present real. We held her memorial at the little house in Brooklyn. I asked Adrian if we could keep it small. Just a few neighbors, old friends, the kind of people who knew her favorite tea, the stories she used to tell. He didn't hesitate. He made it happen, quietly, without fanfare. I stood in our old living room, watching sunlight pool on the worn floorboards, remembering all the times I'd curled up at her feet as a child, listening to the soft hum of her voice as she read to me from her favorite books. I wondered, for the first time, if she had ever known how deeply those small, ordinary moments would shape me. I think she did. After the guests had gone, Adrian helped me carry the last of the flowers out to the little garden in the back, now overgrown and wild, but still breathing with the stubborn life my mother had always believed in. I knelt in the dirt, my fingers brushing through the weeds and cracked soil. "She used to plant lavender here," I whispered. "Every spring." Adrian crouched beside me, pressing his palm flat against the earth. "Maybe we could bring it back." I looked at him, this man who had once been nothing but a stranger standing across from me at an altar neither of us believed in. This man who had quietly carried more heartache than I had ever imagined. This man who had knelt before me days ago and asked, not for forgiveness, but for a beginning. And somehow, without even meaning to, we had already begun. We returned to the tower that evening, our hands still dusted with earth. Adrian didn't go to his office. He didn't retreat behind closed doors. He followed me into the kitchen, the small one tucked in the back, the place where I had first learned to breathe again. He watched quietly as I made tea, the way my mother had taught me. Slowly, carefully, like it mattered. When I handed him his mug, he took it without a word, cradling it between his palms like it was something precious. We sat at the tiny table by the window, our knees brushing beneath the worn wood. After a long while, Adrian broke the silence. "You never asked me to choose you," he said softly. I set my mug down, looking up to meet his gaze. "I never wanted to force you to." He leaned forward, his eyes steady, his voice steady. "Then let me choose you now," he whispered. I felt my throat tighten. "You already have," I whispered back. He reached for my hand, lacing our fingers together, grounding me in something I no longer wanted to run from. "I don't know what kind of husband I'm going to be," he admitted, his thumb brushing gently over my knuckles. "But I want to spend the rest of my life trying to be the kind you deserve." I swallowed hard, feeling something crack open deep in my chest. "I don't want perfect, Adrian," I whispered. "I just want you." We moved through the next few weeks carefully but together, rebuilding not a marriage born from duty, but something new, something chosen. He started joining me for breakfast, in the small kitchen, leaving the formal dining room empty. We tended the plants in the conservatory together, planting fresh lavender in every corner. He showed me the hidden places in the tower, the little reading nook his mother had loved, the forgotten piano in the music room no one had touched in years. We learned each other in the quiet, in the small, ordinary moments that no one else ever saw. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the city, Adrian found me on the balcony, the place where I had once stood, lost and trembling, wondering if I had made the biggest mistake of my life. He came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist, pressing his cheek against my hair. "I used to think this city belonged to me," he whispered, his breath warm against my skin. "But I was wrong. You are my home, Isabel." I turned in his arms, looking up at the man who had once felt like nothing but a stranger behind a glass wall. "You saved my family," I whispered. "You saved me, long before I even knew I needed saving." His hands cupped my face, his thumbs brushing away the tears I hadn't realized had fallen. "And you," he whispered, his voice breaking with something raw and real. "You saved me, Isabel. You saved the best parts of me I thought I'd buried forever." We stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in the fading light, the city humming quietly beneath our feet, and in that moment I knew we weren't just surviving anymore. We were living together, not because we had to, not because the world had pushed us there, but because we had chosen to stay. Later that night, as Adrian drifted to sleep beside me, his breathing slow and steady against my shoulder, I reached for the notebook I'd left on my nightstand. I opened it to a fresh page and began to write. Not because I had all the answers, but because I finally understood the question. "Dear Mom," I wrote, "I think you were right. Some things are worth beginning, even when they start in all the wrong ways. And this is just the beginning. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. And if you'd like to hear more heartfelt journeys like this one, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you again soon."